Welcome to Chatter. I'm David Priess. This week, former CIA analyst, manager, and executive Peter Clement on what Putin wants.
When he went into Crimea in 2014, in his major speech, he actually said, hey, look, we don't want any more Ukraine. This is all we want. So I asked myself, how did we get from that to where we were in 2021, 2022? He's as powerful, just about as powerful as Stalin was. I'm struck by the parallels with the control of the media, the fact that we can't call a war, it's a special military operation. You can be arrested for calling it a war. To me, that smacks of the 1930s, where people would worry about somebody knocking on your door saying, we heard you said something critical. We need to have a conversation. If he actually has to resort to a second full-blown mobilization that starts to draw upon the children of the elites and Muscovites and St. Petersburgers, I think that's a potential triggering event that could set people off.
Peter, welcome to Chatter.
Thank you. Glad to be here, David.
I'm glad to have you here. I've been wanting to have this conversation in long form for quite a while. We've talked about it briefly on other occasions, but I find myself thinking over and over again in the last couple of years, what does Putin really want? And how do we know? And are our perceptions of him informed more by our own assumptions and stereotypes or more by actual knowable things? And those are all questions that you are uniquely placed to answer, given 50 plus years of experience watching or being interested in Russian history, culture, watching Putin from multiple angles. So thank you for joining me. This is great.
Oh, it's great to be here. And obviously, this is a subject of great personal interest. And I continue to be just intrigued at trying to understand Mr. Putin and where Russia is going.
Yeah. And you've seen it from multiple perspectives, and we'll get into some of that. But I first have to call you out for something remarkable that you're doing that you don't give yourself credit for. So you are now teaching, among other things, you're teaching at Columbia, having retired from CIA now, 6 years ago or so.
Yes.
But you're still living in the Washington, D.C. area, which I think gives you the record for the longest regular long-term commute. Wow. You do a lot of traveling back and forth up to New York, don't you?
I do. I'm a regular Amtrak follower, and I love the quiet car. I'm one of the hardliners in the quiet car. But true story. So one of my predecessors who taught this course at Columbia, a former agency employee, Mark Lowenthal, he did this for 11 years, and he actually took the airplane. He took the shuttle.
No. That's the wrong answer.
This is pre 9/11.
Yeah.
You could run downtown, get to the shuttle, get to New York, and he taught a 6 o'clock class. Oof. And then he would come home, lived in Reston for 11 years. So he's got me beat.
Oh, see, at that point, just based on economics, I'd have to do the math in my head, but it's almost cheaper to learn how to fly a helicopter yourself and get landing rights. I don't know. That's crazy.
It is.
But you make it work. You make it work.
I got a lot of work done. It's great.
Yeah. So as a bit of a scene setter, before we get into Putin and what we can and cannot know about his innermost thoughts and desires, let's go back to your background. I mean, you started with an interest in Russian history when you were just a wee young lad and went off to get your doctorate in it and found yourself doctorate interrupted by a CIA career, and you ended up going back and getting that doctorate. But do you recall going back to when you were 15 or 10 or 5? What was it that sparked your interest in Russia in the first place? And was it more about society and culture or more about politics and current events?
Well, that's a great question, and one I get asked a lot, and I hate to admit this, but my first recollection of anything to do with Russia was watching Dr. Zhivago. I saw the movie. That's not a bad gateway. And I thought, wow, this is so different than anything I've studied at that point in high school in American history. And I thought, this is just so fascinating and different. and intriguing that I thought I've got to learn a little bit more about this. So as an undergraduate, I took my first class in Russian history as a junior at Oswego. And then I thought, I really want to dig into this. It's so intriguing, the characters, the personalities. Not that ours isn't, as I'm coming more and more to appreciate. But that's what got me started, basically.
And when did the Russian language bug kick in?
As an undergraduate. I started taking it as an undergrad and then in graduate school.
Russian is regarded as a relatively difficult language to master. That is, learning the alphabet and learning some basic sounds and grammar. I've heard that its difficulty is overrated in that sense, but mastering it is really difficult. Do you feel over the years that you developed enough of a mastery of it that you would dream in Russian and you could think in a Russian language kind of way?
No. Truth in advertising, I'm a much better reader than a speaker. I'm envious of people like Strobe Talbot or some of the people I've worked with over the years, Fiona Hill, Angela Stent, who really are quite fluent. I'm not at all in their category. I'm much more of a reader. As I tell my students who are strong in the language, tell them, keep it up. One of the challenges is just maintaining it over time. If you don't work on this every day, you start to lose it.
I don't know about your experience as an analytic manager, but I'll tell you mine and see if you had a parallel on the Russian side. But on one account, I was managing a difficult country, very important for U.S. interests, and a foreign language that was very different than English. There were some analysts, and I'm thinking of a couple, who were some of the sharpest analysts I ever worked with, who had minimal to no language skills, but they were able to process information. They were able to use, argumentation and logic and evidence and put it together. They understood the country well, even though they felt they had this huge deficit in language. And then we had some analysts who were fluent. I mean, absolutely fluent, maintained it constantly, could probably speak and think as well in that language as in English. And I found that was okay, that I kind of liked having both. I liked having somebody who could do that, and I think it did add to the richness of a lot of what we did. But I think there's a myth out there that everyone who works on a country and is an analyst of a particular country needs to be a master of the language and the culture in every way, instead of just being a really good thinker applying her skills or his skills to that country. So kick that to you for agreement, disagreement, debate.
No, I completely agree. And some of the people who I admire the most are the analysts, and I put Tom Graham, Fiona Hill, Strobe Talbot, Angela. They do both. But as a manager of analysts, I found that some of my best analysts were what you described. Some were great linguists, and I loved having them because they could watch, especially in the turbulent 1990s, I'd be watching Russian TV, and we were trying to do like real-time analysis of all the crazy things under Yeltsin.
Yeah.
And some of them were also top-notch analysts. But I also had great analysts who weren't as fluent. And you need both, basically. And I still believe that. I don't think you have to be a superb linguist to be a good analyst. It helps.
Yeah. Well, across your career at CIA, you did the analysis, you did the managing up through the analytic levels, up to years and years on the 7th floor, helping to lead the Directorate of Intelligence, and then running the Eurasia Europe Mission Center, whatever it's actually called these days. But I seem to recall you saying some of your best experiences were actually, early on, starting out, like getting to Moscow for the first time in 1985, when something interesting was happening with the leadership. Tell us what, I think it was Chernenko era. What happened when you were there in 85?
Clearly one of the career highlights for me as a young analyst and a serious Kremlinologist, because at the time we didn't have a lot of great intelligence about who was doing what and decision-making in the Politburo. So the night I arrived, Chernenko, who was then the general secretary, died. And so I go, oh my God, I'm going to be here for a succession. And it just doesn't get any better than that. It was so exciting. I worked, I think I was there for a week, worked in the embassy in the political section, got to watch all the activities on Russian TV. And my account basically was Soviet foreign policy. Got to watch all the foreign delegations arriving, serious Kremlinology on why didn't Fidel Castro come to the funeral? Why was it his brother? Did that have any meaning about the relationship? And then watching Gorbachev be selected because we had lived through 3 deaths, Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko, in the period of 3 years. And everybody joked about the gerontocracy running the Soviet Union. And now we had, I think Gorbachev was 52 or 53 at the time. So we knew we're in for a whole different cast of characters, thinking. He brought along Shevardnadze. And you felt like you were in the middle of great change. And it was just so exciting as an analyst to live through this.
Okay, so you mentioned like Kremlinology, right? The art of looking at what's available. And it's not necessary, but I think it's implied that it emphasizes open sources. So the skills of Kremlinology, you're using chronologies, you're thoroughly reading the media, you're looking at the Soviet leaders' speeches, at what they're saying, and just as importantly, what they're not saying. Yes, of course, you're looking at who is standing at the podium or, looking out at the parade grounds. But there's a whole lot of what we end up later on calling things like network analysis or targeting analysis, where you're looking at personal networks, educational networks, relationships among the elites. That's not unique to Russian analysis. That's what I think good analysts do. But it really became associated with analysis of Russia during the Cold War. Why is that? And how do you feel that characterized or is different from analysis on other accounts you've had exposure to?
I actually think it's inherent in almost any political dynamic in any country. I've really become a true believer in the importance of personal relationships, and Putin is par excellence an exemplar of this. If you look at all the people around him today, most of them are Petersburgers, people he worked with in Petersburg and he brought along, or worked with in the KGB in his early years. And when I was doing my research on my dissertation, it was the same thing. It was, who were the people surrounding Stalin? Where did they come from? How did they meet? And during the Khrushchev period, we would look at who stood next to who. We analyzed all the speeches. But Bob Blackwell, who was a branch chief in SOVA then, Bob did these amazing studies, I think before he worked with the agency as an academic, about the regional party secretaries and who was moving up in the local regions and how they made their way to the Politburo. It was all about relationships and friendships. And Putin talks about this openly in his own book, this autobiographical book in 2000 called First Person. And it just struck me as it's the same in our country. If you look at all the people and the relationships, a lot of it has to do with friendships you cultivated early along the way and people you bring along.
Now, watching it over a long period of time, I'm just curious how much reflecting about the act of doing so occurs. That is, over time, you get so used to doing that, and you end up reading so much into speeches and looking at the networks that it could create one of those mental obstacles to recognizing change, right? You're looking for small changes, right?
Yeah.
The very act of doing it is you're looking for who's standing next to whom, or they mentioned this in the last 7 speeches, but suddenly they didn't. So you're looking for that level of change. But in terms of a systemic shift, does it actually make it harder to see big picture changes when you're looking at such minutia?
Yeah, I think it can be, absolutely. I've actually spent a lot of time thinking about the debate about the collapse of the Soviet Union, because some people make that argument that, in fact, we were so engrossed in all the minutia of political maneuvering and so on that we missed the collapse. I don't share that view. We can talk about that later if you want. But I do think it's very, very important to pull yourself back, try to see the bigger picture, but as important, bring in other voices, talk with other people, particularly non-experts. This is why I'm such a huge fan of the red cell. You want to have people who aren't mired. The whole story about the paradox of expertise. And the metaphor that I really like is the one about the fox and the hedgehog. And they talk about a forest, and the fox knows everything about the forest, the dimensions, the size, all the different kinds of trees. And then here's the hedgehog who knows everything about the one big tree, how old it is, every ring inside the tree, every dent, every nail that was put into it. That's the problem. And you want to have some foxes who can say, hey, have you seen what's going on in the neighborhood? There's a forest fire coming, and soon the entire forest is going to go away. So what use will that hedgehog be when there's no more forest? I love that metaphor.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you're right. And the historical record does show that the analysis on the Soviet Union in the 1980s actually holds up pretty well. That critics can look at it, and some have, including policymakers, and say, but you didn't tell us exactly what was going to happen when. And of course, that reflects a bias towards intelligence that it is supposed to predict the future, which is not the kind of insight delivery that is the strength of intelligence. So you can always find, yes, it could have been better in some specific ways. But if you look at identifying the trends, at pointing out some of the threats to the Soviet system, pointing out some of the individual choices that Gorbachev would have to make and would make, the record actually is pretty good for the analysis at CIA at the time.
Well, I would agree. I think sometimes part of the problem for some analysts is whatever account you're working. We would have big debates at the time about how serious all the forces were that Gorbachev had unleashed in Perestroika and Glasnost, and also all the ferment and civil unrest in some of the republics, especially in the Caucasus or the Baltic states. Mm-hmm. And we would make the point as political analysts, Gorbachev is in a heap of trouble, and this is going to change a lot, particularly in foreign policy. And the military analysts who were following the military and issues, we had an entire division that looked at like defense spending. And their counter argument was, if Gorbachev is such a great reformer and he's supporting all these changes, why is 1988 the single biggest year of Soviet defense spending in the middle of all this? Well, that's a fact I can't deny.
Yeah.
That was part of our debate. But I thought, to me, it seemed pretty evident, certainly by 89, 90, that all the ferment and the democratization and actually uttering the idea that the party would have to compete in elections, we could all see where this was going. And of course, then there was the coup in August of 91, which our office director, George Colt, at the time, wrote that famous memo about the Soviet cauldron that pretty much said, this coup's about to happen. Something big is going to happen. Gorbachev can't control it any longer.
Yeah.
Exciting times.
I think, going from there into the 1990s, and you were heavily involved in this era of analysis and management of analysts, that my bumper sticker for the 90s in Russia is like the era of oligarchs and the era of this development of this new political culture, societal culture, if you will, after the Cold War. And it sure seemed like going into the end of the 1990s that, that would be the future path, started by Yeltsin, not controlled by him. But then Putin comes in and does some things a little bit differently. And I'm curious, obviously he was on everyone's radar as soon as Yeltsin reached out and tapped him and said, you're it. But before that, when he was in St. Petersburg, he was young. He had no political base of his own before that. He didn't seem to be special or unique in any significant way. But am I missing something? Was it clear to some people, even in St. Petersburg, that this was someone who was on the rise and was going to be able to take advantage of opportunities as well as he did in the matter of just a couple of years?
I don't think anybody can say they predicted that. One of the discussions we had in the office when it became clear that Putin was, he was named the prime minister, Yeltsin said he's my guy to run in the election.
Right.
Nobody knew exactly when Yeltsin would step down, but he had identified him. At that point, there had been 5 prime ministers between 1996 and 1999. And obviously, whoever was named prime minister was the successor if something were to happen to Yeltsin, which was a real possibility health-wise.
Right.
So Putin arrived. He had been the FSB chief for barely a year, and we didn't know a whole lot about him. One of the ironies, and one of the reasons I love teaching right now, David, is there are these wonderful biographies of Putin. One came out in 2015, one in 2022, with incredible amounts of detail about literally the days and months of Putin's early life and how he came to Moscow and who he knew and how he got to these positions. We had no idea. We just didn't have that kind of information then. Now it's great. I love teaching about it. But at the time, we were left with the bare outlines of who he was. We knew where he came from and so on. He worked for Sobchak in St. Petersburg as a first vice mayor. But there was a lot we just didn't have windows into. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I recall the most is we had a great debate within the analytic cohort in my office. I was the division chief at the time. And I said, we need to tell our readers what we know and don't know and how we think about Putin and what kind of a leader he might be. And so there was a healthy debate. And some said, you know what? Once KGB, always KGB. This is a KGB man. He's a tough guy. There were others who said, have you read the millennial speech, this big address he gave on the eve of the year 2000? It's the most sobering, critical self-assessment of just how bad off the country is, what needs to be done. And this is a guy who's a realist and is prepared to make a lot of changes. He does talk about the importance of the role of the state, but he does talk about the fact part of the salvation of Russia lies in integrating in the world economy. So that group's Putin the modernizer, if you will. Less the KGB guy. Then there was a third group, and this is a very small group. The debate was really those two. The third school was, well, what if he's just really a tool of the oligarchs? So that was the empty suit school. Mm-hmm. Not many people bought into that, but it was one we thought for our readership, we should tell them, there's different ways, because the oligarchs, when Putin first came in, were still very powerful and strong, right, and gained a lot of political and economic influence under Yeltsin. But that changed quickly. But that, again, shows just how little we actually knew about Putin himself. Then that book came out. I mentioned earlier, this is the book called First Person. They issued it right around the time of the presidential campaign in early 2000. And the title is First Person, an astonishingly frank self-portrait by Russia's president. Okay, Putin had just been elected. And they put it out there because nobody in the world knew much about Putin.
Yeah, so it really was his way of introducing himself, right? Because
exactly.
There was no existing huge compendium of his life. And here's his chance to make those, make the impressions he wanted to have made.
And I make this required reading of my course on Russian security policy, because I find it not just fascinating, but very revealing about so much about Putin's beliefs, his personality. There's so many anecdotes I could use, many, many rabbit holes. But the book is a series of interviews. There are a lot of interviews with Putin, but also school teachers, friends from his judo club in his earlier years, current members in the government. So it's a fascinating set of different windows into who Putin is. The best ones for me, though, are the ones where he talks about his views. For example, there's just two or three points that are really important. The issue of loyalty. He's asked in the interview, you have a lot of friends. Well, I have a few close friends, and he names them. Sergei Ivanov, Nikolai Patrushev, Kudrin, Dima Medvedev, who was younger than him. So all these people, of course, become very powerful, important people, even to this day, and they're all Petersburgers. He doesn't use the word loyalty. He says, I have some close friends, and most important is they've never betrayed me, and I have never betrayed them. He could have said loyalty. So I'm wondering, too, about betrayal. He doesn't forget things if you cross him. Another thing that really jumped out at me was having lived through the demise of Yugoslavia. Mm-hmm. He actually used the phrase, the thing I fear the most is the Yugoslavization of Russia. This is because of the war with Chechnya. And he could see all these ethnic divisions. You have ethnic republics and minorities. He was increasingly worried that that could happen here and that outsiders might try to advance that process, which gets us to a little bit to where we are even today. He seems really obsessed with this issue about securing the integrity of Russia from this kind of internal dissolution. The one other thing, and I'll stop. He also says that we Russians are Europeans. We are part of European culture. And wow, at a time now when Putin says we are at war with Western civilization, it's not just Ukraine and the Americans, it's the entire West and their cultural norms and this obsession with countering what he calls evil moral influences, which we could talk about later. But what a contrast between then and now.
No kidding. See, I did not read that book. I did not have the opportunity to take a class with you. But I had to get smart on Russia enough that when I was briefing the PDB, and you also were on the briefing team for part of that time as we crossed over briefing different customers, I had to understand Russia better because it was one of those topics. Yes, the war on terror was huge. This is the 2002, 2003 era. But there were issues of Russia and China and others where I felt like I had to get up to speed. And my impressions of Putin, to the best of my memory, going back in time, were in that era, I was struck by how much international travel the man did soon after taking office for somebody who presumably did not have a very strong domestic political base of his own, who had come up very quickly and unexpectedly. He was all over the world for the first year or two, traveling to every world capital, being seen as, if not a new Russia, definitely putting the emphasis on we are part of the world. We want this WTO thing. Not giving the impression of consolidating at home and trying to build up his own base, but really using the international connections to try to build Russia up. And at least that was my impression. And that's not based on any classified reading. That's just based on things like the fact he was always, every few weeks, he was traveling to a different world capital. So it seems to me that he played his cards right in that way, at least. Nothing happened domestically that got in his way. He used the things that did happen domestically, like the hostage taking at the theater, I recall, was 2002. The Beslan tragedy a couple of years later with the slaughter of the school children. He manipulated those and used those to do things like weaken the media, to lock down political control, to keep the oligarchs out of his inner circle, if you will. But very, very interesting strategy for somebody who had come in the way he did.
I very much agree with you, David. It is striking the amount of foreign travel he did. And I think part of that reflects his desire to ensure that Russia needs to be recognized as still an important player in the world, in geopolitics. Yeah. It's interesting. The very first trip he took was to China, not by accident. And he's made multiple trips to China since, at critical moments, usually around the time of the crises with Ukraine in 2014, and again in more recently, 2023, 24. So that was part of it. You raised another interesting issue. How did he do that while he was trying to manage things domestically? I thought I was reading a little bit into your comment. Was he potentially at risk? He's a new guy. He's busy traveling. And we still have the oligarchs. And it's important to remember that actually he had what I call a come to Jesus meeting with the oligarchs. I believe it was in July 2000. They were all summoned, all of the big players. And the message loud and clear from him was, there's a new sheriff in town. You can keep your money. We're not going to get into how you earned it and how much of it was legal or not. But there are certain ground rules. And one of them is you need to stay out of politics. One person violated that rule. His name was Hodorkovsky. And by 2004, when he started making noises about maybe running for office, he suddenly found himself mired in investigations and getting arrested. And
funny how that works.
Yeah, funny how that works. The other thing that really influenced Putin's thinking was, in addition to trying to rein in the oligarchs, he also worried about the media, because the media under Yeltsin had been incredibly open and critical of Yeltsin the war in Chechnya, the first war, and Putin was very uncomfortable with that. The event that finally triggered his revolt against the media, and it moves to basically gain control of them through new ownerships among oligarchs that worked with him, was the sinking of the Kursk submarine, nuclear sub that had the accident. That was also in 2000 in the summer. And Putin was on vacation, was slow to respond. Perhaps he didn't get good briefings on the magnitude of the problem, but everybody in the ship died. He showed up a little late, and the media just crucified him. That, I think, was the moment at which he said, okay, we can't have that kind of media any longer. And slowly he put pressure on Kuczynski and some of the owners of big media to either sell out or have problems. And soon they came under the ownership of people much more friendly to Putin. So he dealt with that problem. But he had a learning curve in the beginning. So you were right to say, in addition to these foreign trips, he did have some issues that he needed to worry about at home.
Yeah. So this first 5 years or so, and I'm slowly and inartfully trying to build up to a conversation of what we know about Putin versus what we assume about Putin, and how our assumptions create this image of him that itself kind of informs how we take in new information. But this first 5 years or so, it seems like the image of Putin in the West was very limited, right? It was limited to, I think in the popular imagination, perhaps it was limited only to scenes of him and President Bush at the ranch in Crawford, smiling and, being friendly because Putin had made the decision, yes, we will essentially support the U.S. war on terror in exchange, hopefully, for a free reign without Western criticism of what we want to do within Russia. But it seemed like the impression was very limited, that it wasn't a deep, nuanced understanding of Putin and his ultimate motivations, but it was more just surface of how does he relate to the biggest issues of the time, one being the war on terror, and then second, is he going to do anything big and bad to basically make it like the Cold War again? And if the answer to the first was a positive, that he's, quote, helping us, or at least not harming, and then the answer to the second is, well, no, Russia is more useful now than they are an enemy. Now, you were in the middle of it, so maybe it's hard to see, but is that how you think the popular perception of Putin was, at least for a while after he took office?
I think you put your finger on a very, very important issue. I think in terms of Western media, initially, I think Putin was received kind of agnostically as potentially a positive force. He had seemed to have good social skills. He had a good relationship with Bush. But underneath that, and I think we were aware of this in the office, that there was this other side to Putin. The meeting with the oligarchs was a real important indicator, and then the crackdown in the media. And he also hinted at this in that Millennial article and in the book interview. He likes stability. The state has a very important role to play, and he's very transactional. He didn't say that in the book, but if you read his comments when he made a really hard decision to support Bush after 9/11, he was one of the first people to call the president, saying how horrible an event this was, and he wanted to be helpful. When Bush requested permission for U.S. forces to have overflight rights to get to Central Asia in preparation for the intervention in Afghanistan, Putin faced resistance within his own leadership, including from Sergei Ivanov, one of his closest friends at the time, defense minister. And Ivanov said publicly, this can't happen. We can't have this. And Putin overruled it, that opposition. But if you read the speech, there's a linkage. Putin very clearly says, we want to help. And of course, we would expect to see similar kinds of support on our side. And when we started being critical of the second war in Chechnya, we even had some American officials meeting with members of the putative Chechen independent government in Washington. Boy, that really was a red line for Putin. I think the anger about that that was one of the big triggering points that began to sour the relationship. There's two other big ones that happened in that period between 2003, 2007, 8. One was the continued expansion of NATO. The Baltic states entered in 2004. That was kind of a fait accompli, not much to be done, but they didn't like it. And they said it, but they said, states have the right to make sovereign decisions like this. But we think this is a security problem. But the bigger one, in my view, was the election in Ukraine in 2004. And here, an election here between Yushchenko and Yanukovych. The Russia guy was Yanukovych, much more inclined to be, what I would say, pro-Russian. And Putin actually visited, essentially kind of campaigning on Yanukovych's behalf. The election proved to be flawed. Election monitors in the West criticized Yanukovych's election, and they had a redo, and Yushchenko won in the redo. Well, for Putin, this was a huge personal embarrassment / humiliation. And I think that combined with the criticism of how the Russians dealt with their terrorist problems, dealing with the Chechens and the NATO thing, that's when I think we begin to see the much harder line that evolves over time into where we are today. But the beginnings are in that period already, early on.
Let me ask a little bit about that, because looking back, when you trace, as you did in a Foreign Affairs article a year or two ago, when you trace some of Putin's thinking about Ukraine in particular and how it fits into that worldview, you can look at that and say, well, clearly, that. But at the time, it's hard to say. In general, did analysts and Russia watchers see this as the beginning of something, or see this as just a discrete event that Putin was reacting to?
Oh, that's a good question. I will confess, I was out of the office then. I was no longer the chief Russia watcher. I was in New York, so I wasn't in the day to day. But my impression is that we saw this as a pretty big deal among the analysts. I don't know that anybody was saying that this is the end of the relationship and things can't be improved. But for Putin, this was such a big setback. I don't know that everybody fully appreciated how vengeful a person he was. Although the event with Khodorkovsky should have been a signal. I think we did write a lot about that. That was a pretty telling indicator of how vengeful he can be. But the Ukraine thing stuck with him for a long time. And I think part of this goes to his belief that Ukraine really is so intertwined with Russia. They're kind of us. As he writes in this long essay in 2021 entitled The Historical Unity of the Russians and Ukrainians. I don't think that thought was as fully developed as it became later, but he, like a lot of other Russians, typically believe that Ukraine really is, part and parcel of our Russia culture and our people, that they're not so distinct. Mm-hmm. And so I think this setback, in part because Yushchenko was also someone leaning toward the West. And when Ukrainians start talking about being more fully integrated with Europe and maybe even thinking about NATO, that's a pretty big break with Russians' concept of what Ukraine is.
Okay, so you're talking about Ukraine specifically now. And yes, by 2021, the rhetoric had gotten there. But much earlier on, his rhetoric was not that way. And what I have a hard time telling, and I'm not sure anyone can tell, was that because early on, his true beliefs were what they are now about Ukraine. And what Putin really wants is Ukraine, if it exists at all, to be a rump state that's focused in its western part, because it's really kind of a small little, might as well bring back Galicia and other small Eastern European, Central European states. And the rest of it really is Russia and always has been. Maybe he's always believed that, and he just didn't feel like he could or should say that earlier in his rule. Or maybe his thinking evolved. Maybe he thought, okay, the geopolitical situation is such that Ukraine is what it is and I have to deal with it. And it'd really be nice to not worry about Sevastopol and Crimea and the base there. But it is fine and we can handle what happens in Ukraine. And then as time went on, he realized, you know what? We can actually do better. We can actually make Ukraine Russian in whole or in part. Where do you come down on this? Like, did his thinking change based on what we can tell, or did he always believe what he believes now and he just had to fake it?
Yeah, that for me, that's $1 million question, David. I go both ways, to be honest. I used to think it evolved, and when he went into Crimea in 2014, in his major speech, he actually said, hey, look, we don't want any more Ukraine. This is all we want. The Crimea has always been Russian. Everybody knows it. All the Russian people, if you looked at opinion polls, vast majorities in the 90 percentile range would say, yeah, of course, Crimea is Russia. Have you read any literature by famous 19th century authors? It's all about Crimea. And then there's the eastern provinces, where there is a heavy ethnic Russian population, and some of them there maybe felt that kinship. I think others less so. But he did say that we don't have anything else. We don't want any more. He was very explicit about this. So I asked myself, how did we get from that to where we were in 2021, 2022?
Yeah.
So it's part of two questions for me: is how did that happen, and the other part was, how did a guy that I used to think was very pragmatic in terms of foreign policy risk taking? 2008, he goes into Georgia, tiny little country. The Georgians are greatly overmatched. Saakashvili contributed to a scenario where the Russians could say with some legitimacy, well, we didn't start this. We were prepared for it. We went in and we bloodied his nose, marched to Tbilisi almost. There's a powerful message there. Saakashvili was already talking about NATO. This is a red line for us. They're not going to be in NATO, and we'll take whatever steps necessary. But that was low risk. They had a mass advantage there. Then you look at what happened in Crimea. Again, low risk. It wasn't a major invasion. Crimea is heavily populated with Russian naval forces and smaller military units. That was a piece of cake. And then you have the Russian-inspired rebellions in some of the provinces in the east. They didn't have descended in big military force. And they set off a confrontation, which makes it much harder for Ukraine to pursue NATO membership because you have this internal territorial dispute. Again, low cost, not high risk, kind of a success story from his vantage point. Georgia, Crimea. Then you have Syria. Again, not a big intervention, a big gain. They didn't send ground troops. They send in a lot of military support, naval assistant, weaponry, and in return they get a naval facility at Tartus. So I'm thinking, this guy gets a lot for where Russia is, basically, given their internal problems. But then, in 2021-22, he launches the biggest land invasion in Europe since World War II. How do you go from that kind of pragmatic risk taker to a guy who rolls the dice on a big invasion? Now, we know a little bit in hindsight. I think he had very bad intelligence, and the FSB has to bear a lot of the responsibility for that in terms of the polls that they conducted and how the Ukrainians would react. But it was a huge, huge risk, and he was warned. Bill Burns on his trip, public statements by Western officials, well, primarily U.S., because the Europeans were not convinced for the most part that he would go in. He had to know there was going to be a cost, but he did it anyway. So this is when I got interested in your earlier question. Did he always have a bigger vision here? Is this even something nobody fully appreciated? Mm-hmm. And in a weird way, David, I have to tell my story about Solzhenitsyn. I for years, I asked myself, why did Putin develop this intriguing relationship with a former Soviet dissident?
Not a natural pairing.
No, and it was his KGB that hounded Solzhenitsyn out of the country, who then lived in Vermont for, I think, 7 or 8 years. Mm-hmm. So, well, even longer than that, actually, more than a decade. So I thought, how do you explain this? Well, maybe Putin sees Solzhenitsyn's return as a good political move. I'm latching on to a famous literary figure. It's great for us. Okay, but I don't know. There's a generation, a lot of young Russians, I suspect, didn't know a whole lot about Solzhenitsyn when he came back. He meets with Solzhenitsyn, and he actually met with him twice personally. And I recall that Solzhenitsyn had written a book back in 1990 called Rebuilding Russia. And if you read the book, Solzhenitsyn's principal argument is the reason the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union collapsed is the leaders lost sight of who they were, and they had become this big multi-ethnic empire with all these minorities and nationality groups. And they lost sight that the real Russia is the Slavic core. And Solzhenitsyn identifies the Slavic core. Guess what? Belarus. Northern Kazakhstan, where there's a large ethnic Russian population, and then Ukraine. And here Solzhenitsyn is very, very careful in saying, look, if the Ukrainians want to not be part of Russia, it's their choice. Obviously, there's a lot of ethnic Russians who live there who feel like they're Russian, but they should not be forced into this recreation of the greater Russia. Unlike Putin, who obviously has decided he's going to use force to affect that.
Right.
So that led me to the kind of my working hypothesis currently about Putin, that I think he really is so obsessed with Russian history that at his age, he's now 71, going on 72, he's thinking about his legacy. And there's a phenomenon of what I would call the growth of the statuaries in Russia. There's statues of many, many Russian famous figures and leaders, including Ivan the Terrible. There's 3 statues of Solzhenitsyn now, by the way, which reinforces my point about Solzhenitsyn. But the interesting one for me is they erected one to Ivan III. Ivan III is, in Russian historians call him Ivan the Great. He was the gatherer of the Russian lands in the late 15th century. So I'm beginning to think of Putin. I wonder if he sees himself.
Including parts of Ukraine, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So is Putin the modern day gatherer of the Russian lands? He's going to recreate that core Slavic state that Solzhenitsyn wrote about.
Mm-hmm. There's definitely something here because, yeah, you're right. You can find reasons to explain, some of these things, but when you put them all together, it is a pattern, and there is enough of a foundation. Now, when were this big statue thing with Ivan III and Solzhenitsyn? It was after the Crimea invasion, right?
Well, the most famous one is the statue erected to Vladimir I, who's the founder of what was then Kiev Rus.
Right.
And both the Ukrainians and the Russians claim him as kind of the founding name in their histories. The statue is like 62 feet tall, and it's outside the Kremlin. It's like a real political statement to the Ukrainians. Vladimir I is us, and he's also part of you, and you belong to us. It's a remarkable statue. But the other ones, like Ivan III, the gatherer of the Russian lands, I could double check the dates. I do have this somewhere.
Right.
But this has been going on for quite a while. They even have one to Nicholas II, believe it or not. It's pretty remarkable. Alexander III, hardline conservative Tsar in the 1880s.
Mm-hmm. So the logic, if I hear you right, the logic here is, and maybe 2014 was a bit of a hinge point, but going back to the early Ukrainian issues 10 years earlier, that probably this was building in Putin's head for a while. Not necessarily the nature of the Donetsk and Luhansk provinces after 2014 and the invasion in 2022, but just the idea of this cannot stand. This idea that Russia is independent, and Ukraine is independent and able to make its own choices regarding EU and NATO. In fact, in Putin's mind, probably all along, he either thought or allowed himself to calculate that enough of what is now considered Ukraine is really core Russian that this will change somehow.
I think that's right. It's the eastern sector, about maybe 20% of Ukraine's landmass. One of the telling points, since you mentioned the EU here, in research for a different chapter I wrote for a book, I'd forgotten about this, but when Medvedev was president, he made a public statement where he explicitly said, Ukraine, we have a good relationship. This is when Yanukovych was now president, like 2009, because he won a subsequent election against Yushchenko. And they had signed a long-term lease for the base of Sevastopol and Crimea, and relations were in a very positive place. Medvedev said publicly, if they want to be part of the EU, that's fine. And I thought, wow. I think personally that contributed to Putin's decision that we can't have Medvedev for a second term. Mm-hmm. He may have well thought he was going to run anyway and do the swap that he did in 2012. But I'm guessing that statement, plus the major error that he made on Libya, supporting the U.S.-NATO intervention there that led to Gaddafi's demise, which Putin strongly disagreed with, and said so. They had an open disagreement about this. I think that sealed Medvedev's fate, that he was no longer going to run for president, if that was ever an option.
Yeah. I'm thinking about this as you're talking, and I'm hearing voices of others who are not in the room here. And these are a lot of voices from what we call, the new Eastern European countries after the Soviet Union. A lot of them were old countries that were just incorporated into the Soviet Union, like Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania. But these Central and Eastern European countries, a lot of people there shook their head in disbelief in 2022 when so many in Western Europe and the United States and around the world, frankly, were shocked, downright shocked that Russia could do something like this when they feel like they had been screaming from the rooftops, why are you pushing a reset button with Russia? Russian political culture, Russian society, it's not just Putin, it's the whole idea that, we have shoot downs of airplanes, we have Crimea, we have Georgia, we have cyber attacks, we have little green men, we have sabotage. And we've been telling you over and over again that Russia is it's just not ready, if you will, to have these conversations about a reset and becoming a responsible member of the international community. And only now when Ukraine gets invaded do you all realize that this thing we've been saying all along is true. How do you manage that? Because you, on the one hand, have been a realist about Russia in many ways for many years, and trying to describe what's happening quite analytically and objectively. On the other hand, we are part of that mindset that for 20 years, there were many attempts being made at a U.S. government and international level to try to see Russia and want to see Russia as a actual or potential contributing member of the international community that didn't do things like engage in massive land invasions of neighbors. How do you process all that in your own head, reflecting on where you were at the time and when you hear people say that about American and Western European policy, and by extension, even you?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. I guess I'm not. You use the word reset. Reset dates back really to 2008, 2009. But Michael McFaul then became the U.S. ambassador, and he was very skeptical. And I think a lot of us in the government, we watched this very closely. And I think the critics who were saying, how could you not see it all? I think we did see that this was not going to be a friendly kind of relationship. I think most of the people who've written on this among the Russia watchers was, we're never going to be the best of friends, but there are areas where we share common interests. And those are the areas where we have to work together to help one another. The obvious example would be our approaches on non-proliferation involving North Korea and even Iran, because the Russians were part of the 2015 deal, that there were areas where we could still work. And that was after the annexation of Crimea, if you think about it. So I think there was a realism. I think a lot of the policymaker and Russia watcher community that Putin's going to be a tough guy to deal with, but there still are areas where we can make some gains, but he needs to be watched very carefully, because we're not entirely, especially after Crimea and especially after the intervention in Syria, he has big geopolitical ambitions to make Russia, again, the great player. In fact, I recall after the intervention in Syria, a lot of experts were saying that Russia has become the new power broker in the Middle East. They're the ones who have the relations with all the actors, where the U.S. increasingly, because of our relationship with Israel and the fact that we deem people like Hezbollah or Hamas or Iran as, basically terrorist entities, that we don't have the ability to talk to all the players the way Russia does. So I think part of this was just Putin's desire to make Russia a big-time player, the way what Gromyko used to say about the Soviet Union: there are no major issues in international affairs that can be resolved without the Soviet Union. I think that's what Putin was aiming for again, to say, but I don't know that people were blind to the problems. I think the issue of invasion, though, is a very valid point there that you raise. The Europeans in particular, except the Brits, but a lot of the Europeans just couldn't believe he would do this. Mm-hmm. And I think the agency and the U.S. government did brief people and alerted people. And Burns made the personal visit to tell the Russians, look, we know what you're up to here. Don't do it.
Right.
And it's pretty remarkable.
We talked briefly earlier about at least my perception of what Putin's perception was in the West in those first couple of years that he had. In the probably, 10 years, 15 years after that, I think the image that started to get into at least the American consciousness of Putin was more of the wily, crafty, too often chess was used as the metaphor, but I think poker, right? Having a bad set of cards, which Russia in many ways...
Playing a weak hand.
Geopolitically had a weak hand.
Yeah.
And yet was coming up with the way of handling the situations in Georgia, Syria, others to probably the maximum Russian advantage that could be had based on those cards. So there was that image. But I think the other image that's stuck with the American consciousness for quite a while is literally an image. And that's Putin projecting himself as the sportsman, as the strong man, not in the sense of a Kim in Korea waving to the crowd, but of the man who is on the horseback without a shirt, of the man who is playing hockey and somehow getting past, 4 defensemen and scoring that goal. So the martial artist Putin, the image of, vitality. And yet I have not seen that lately. You don't see anywhere near as much of that in the last few years, whether that's a function of COVID, whether that's a function of age. There was something a few years ago about hockey again, just within the last couple of years of him playing. And it was just as sad as before, of people not really defending him, and seems to me more pathetic to a culture that knows hockey to actually show that video pretending that he was really good at it. So how do you come down on the imagery of Putin? Because it seems like that, if not lost, it's definitely faded in favor of him at meetings, dressing people down or sitting at a long table or making someone sit next to him and endure his stare, much more than him trying to have this cult of personality built around his physical presence.
Yeah. So, David, I have to show you this slide if you can see this.
Yeah. I can't convey to all of you what I'm seeing, but I'll try. It's a series of images of Putin who's building his image in the Russian media with things like, standing topless in the river, looking strong, or, visiting a military vessel, being a sportsman here and there. So, yeah, you have the images of it, Peter, implying that you've probably analyzed this a lot more than my armchair understanding just did. So how do you come down on this image building of Putin back in the day and how it relates to where he is now?
Yeah, I think it was a conscious effort at image building. I use that slide in my class. I've become a big fan of PowerPoint as a result of the virus, since having to teach online helps a whole lot. But I think we're seeing less of that now. You're absolutely right. And maybe it's a function of age. Maybe he's a little busy, otherwise engaged. But it may also be that I think for him, earlier in his career, I think part of this was him also trying to show it's not just him, but Russia. I'm making Russia, I hate this phrase, I'm making Russia great again, but I'm strong, I'm powerful, I'm virile. Then you have to think about the politics of kind of the homophobia within Russia. This is a very well-received image. It's not a place that's LGBTQ friendly at all. In fact, a lot of activities are outlawed. So I think there's a political dimension to it. There's a virility element about we're making Russia strong again. I'm the strong leader. I'm on top of this pyramid of new power. But more recently, you're right, this dressing down of people, we've seen it a couple of times at very important moments. The big one was the Security Council meeting on the eve of the invasion in 2022, where he dressed down Narushkin, the head of the SVR. I saw that and I was stunned. I watched the whole thing and my jaw dropped and I thought, oh my God, Narushkin's days must be numbered. He's still there, which again goes to the old friendships and relationships. And then he did it again most recently to one of the regional governors from Kursk, who started to blab away about how many people were actually having to be removed and the magnitude of the impact. And Putin said, let the bookkeepers talk about that. That's not your job. You're supposed to talk about what we're doing to combat these people, the terrorists coming in from Ukraine, very openly. And I thought, wow. So this display of political power, even of high-level officials and browbeating them, I suspect he's probably in a different place now. That image-making of the past is not as critical. Everybody knows he's as powerful, I would argue, just about as powerful as Stalin was. I'm struck by the parallels with the control of the media, the fact that we can't call a war, it's a special military operation. You can be arrested for calling it a war. That kind of control, and there are also anecdotal accounts of people ratting out teachers and friends who run afoul of that unwritten law. To me, that smacks of the 1930s, where people would worry about somebody knocking on your door saying, we heard you said something critical. We need to have a conversation. It's frightening. So I think he's at a point where these shows of virility and power are less necessary now. Everybody understands you really don't want to run afoul of him. Bad things can happen quickly.
The impression that I have of this is there's two sides to it. One side is what you've talked about is the image of self and what am I projecting for my own position and my own security and rule. There's that. But it's also, in theory, meant to, maybe the wrong word is inspire, but it's meant to motivate Russians. It's meant to make them feel like they're part of something that's powerful. And by investing in me, like most strongmen do, by investing in me, you're investing in the Russian people and our national character. And yet, if I've seen the numbers right from the analysts whom I respect, the mobilization calls in Russia have been an absolute disaster because there have been many more people who have fled the country who actually responded to the mobilization calls. Hundreds of thousands, by some accounts, perhaps up to 1 million Russian men have left Russia rather than sign up for the military. Does that mean at least the second potential motivation for doing this, to get people to buy into the whole strong Russia concept? Does that mean that he's failed in that?
Yeah, I'm glad that you raised this issue. To me, this is one of the big internal contradictions within Russia today. One of the arguments they make about why Putin is essentially a strategic failure as a result of this war, when you lose anywhere between 300,000 to 1 million of your young men, and who are generationally much more tech savvy and a generation of the future, when they flee the country, you're losing a really important asset and resource. The related part of that is the issue with demographics. There are fewer Russians being born. They have the same population now they had in 1991. And if you consider the people who just left, plus the number of people who've died or are casualties in this war, there's going to be a significant decline in that birth rate in the coming decades.
Right.
To me, those are huge strategic failures. Plus, you've solidified NATO. NATO, you could argue, some people said it was already on a death knell. It's now been reinvigorated as a result of Putin's war. So, to me, those are major failures. But to your question, it's interesting. On the one hand, there are the people who left. On the other hand, if you've read recent accounts, because of the the scale of the propaganda and the messaging on television and so on about the nature of this war, it's not just a war with Ukraine, it's with the West and NATO and Western civilization, and these attempts to portray Russia as, besieged by all these horrible foreign influences, he's generated a certain degree of nationalism. And recent accounts I've read of Russian males leaving high school, they literally want to sign up to go fight in the war and do their part. And I'm thinking, wow, this is frightening, because did they not hear about all the other people who left? Did they not see this? So to me, that's a huge contradiction. And I think potentially it's one of Putin's vulnerabilities. Because you're living in such a closed, totalitarian-like society, it's really hard to know what most Russians actually feel about the regime and Putin in particular. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things I'm doing work on right now is a small conference where we're looking at how do we get to a post-Putin Russia. We're talking about, he could die, or he could be overthrown by an internal coup. And I am low probability, but I do think this Ukraine war has potentially opened up fissures that we just can't quite see yet. Mm-hmm. There have to be people, even people at high levels, who are saying this is such a huge mistake. We need to find a way out of this. And if he were to take a really outlandish step, so one of the scenarios I played with is, what if he actually did say, okay, we're going to use a tactical nuclear weapon? Yeah. And there are people in the military say, we're just not going to do it. And something needs to be done. Yeah. That could be one. Or just if the massive amount, and particularly right now with this incursion, if in fact a lot of people say, this war has gotten so far out of hand now that it's become a problem for us domestically, something needs to be done about Putin. It's hard for me to picture this coming from within the inner circle, but there may be people who are saying at some point, will there be a triggering event that Putin undertakes that gets people thinking we need to act? And if you think about the economic, the Putin oligarchs, the ones who are filthy rich, who run the major corporations like Igor Sechin at Rosneft, the major royal enterprise, they have an interest in not being isolated from the whole world. Despite, and to me, this is another problem, they're so dependent on China now where they can't really negotiate a good deal. China has all the leverage in their oil and gas sales. This is not a good businessman's environment. There's so many markets they could actually cultivate and do better in. So if you had some kind of an alliance between some oligarchs, but you got to have somebody on the inside too, and that for me that's the harder nut to crack. Mm-hmm. But is there somebody there who, at some point, says Putin's done enough? We need to stop, which is what happened to Khrushchev.
I think you raise a really interesting point there about the kind of the business interests. Is I can't believe there are that many, not even oligarchs, but even what we would call just middle to upper class people involved in commerce in any way, who are happy with the trade-off in the last few years from growing ties with European countries and the Western world, and that going away in trade in place of a closer trade agreement with North Korea, which is basically where we're at now. But you raised such an interesting point here. The conventional wisdom that I seem to pick up out there is that, Russia is a country in decline. Russia is a country that does not have a bright future economically other than oil and gas. What is it often said? They're basically the economy of an Italy, but it's almost entirely based on oil and gas. They just happen to have nuclear weapons. So the conventional wisdom out there is that Russia is a declining asset. And all of the trends, demographic trends before the war were bad, with drug use, with early death, life expectancy being bad, brain drain, all the issues you talked about. And those have been magnified by this war. But there are people in Russia who still care, and especially among the ethnic Russians that Putin seems to care about suddenly the most. Well, the war so far, again, according to the conventional wisdom I see, has disproportionately been drawing on ethnic minorities in the Russian Federation. A lot of people from the Caucasus, some people from the Russian Far East, and then even the ethnic Russians who have been brought into the military, many of them with signing bonuses, but some of them in the first round of mobilization. That many of them were disproportionately not from Moscow, St. Petersburg,
Right.
the places, if not the elite, who probably would get out of service for their children and allies anyway, but even the people that they know. Once that turns, once it gets to the point that Russia felt the need to do a full mobilization and actually say, okay, we're bringing out the real manpower now. We are going to recruit from the population centers. Some people think that that would be a turning point, that that's where people would say, yeah, we're kind of humiliated by the fact we have a trade agreement with North Korea and we're not making money the way we were by trading with Western Europe. And now you're telling me that my cousin or my wife's family is going to be complaining to me because their son has to go off to war. This is now too much. Is that us trying to apply lessons of past cases in other countries? Or is there some wisdom there in terms of this building up to a tipping point for Putin?
No, I actually think that's a really distinct possibility, David. When I was talking about triggers, if he actually has to resort to a second full-blown mobilization that starts to draw upon the children of the elites and Muscovites and St. Petersburgers, I think that's a potential triggering event that could set people off. The economy is a complicated issue, too, in that because of the defense industry build up now, there lots of employment, although sometimes they don't have enough people. And this is another problem that gets to the demographics. To do all this, in some cases, they have to bring in Central Asians and other people to do menial labor so other people can move up and take these manufacturing jobs. That's a big problem. And I think if he were to have another mobilization call, it would exacerbate that problem. A lot of oligarchs are still doing well. They're still managing to get oil and gas out illegally, in addition to China, although most of it is there. Some people are trying to put, what's that phrase about put lipstick on a pig or something? Actually, this has been good because we always needed to diversify the economy. Now we're making our own brie or our own cheese or our own this or that. But I'm sorry, that's not making you a world-class technological power or a computer power. They don't really make enough of their own cars. There's so many areas that could be developed that haven't been. That could change if you had a more enlightened leadership. But right now, it's still a kind of a mono economy, a gasoline station, as one politician said, a gasoline station for the world. That's not a healthy economy. So despite the fact the economy seems to be okay right now, I'm less convinced that it's so okay. And I think that's a vulnerability. That plus, if you add it to the mobilization call, if there is one, then I think we could get to one of these scenarios where people say Putin's gone too far.
Yeah.
We'll see. Low probability probably, but I wouldn't dismiss it.
A lot of studies looking at rapid political change, right, coup or other thing like it, often point to the need for, if not a unified opposition, at least a strong political leader who can step into a vacuum. And most cases in history have that, and a lot of the failures of a system falling apart do seem to lack that. Well, Putin, if nothing else, seems to have done a pretty good job of marginalizing, co-opting, or finding a way to have a loss of life involving people who could, in theory, serve as rival political figures. I don't want to get into the business of guessing who would be that person who would step in if something were to happen to Putin in the next month or two, but are there people that the Russians have any kind of faith and belief in, or has Putin used the last 20 years, 25 years remarkably well in terms of marginalizing so many people that there really isn't anyone imaginable who would easily step up and play that role?
That's another really hard one. The one that I am most intrigued by right now, who could potentially play that role, but it would be a tricky path to navigate, is Alexander Bortnikov, the head of the FSB. In the old Soviet system, we had the heads of the police, the KGB, like Beria, who everybody had to turn on because they feared him. A, because he had ambitions that were pretty blatant, but B, he had the files on everybody. Bortnikov's that kind of a guy. If anybody knows anything about all the other players, it's him. So I would assume Putin understands that as well. I'm still struck that Bortnikov has a job. It was the FSB that didn't help him out in terms of their analysis on what would happen in Ukraine. And yet he's still there. So maybe he figures, I don't want too much instability. I don't want to muck around with the leadership. But I have to believe he sees Bortnikov as one of the principal people he should be worried about. The other was around him, like Patrushev. Patrushev is even more insanely hawkish in his worldview than even Putin. And Medvedev, the former president, who I used to think was a semi-rational modern man, some of his public statements are equally crazy. And I also don't see him as a real plausible successor.
Yeah.
So then I start to think about, would it be a technocrat like the current prime minister, Mishustin, who doesn't have much of a reputation as a political player, low-key, and by terms of the Constitution, if Putin were to die unexpectedly, quickly, for some reason, the prime minister is the acting president for 3 months, then you have an election. So one of the scenarios I've been playing around with in this project for this conference is the dynamics among the inner circle, and how would that play out? Would some of the serious power brokers really accept Mishustin as his successor? And that's why Bortnikov becomes important. Bortnikov could be one of the people who can make or break the succession process.
Yeah. This is the kind of extension of Kremlinology that I get the feeling you still love, right? Trying to play out the relationships, the people, the scenarios under which this could happen. But at least for now, we've still got Putin. And it still comes back to me to a couple of core questions. What does Putin really want? Did he want this scenario in Ukraine? Obviously, it hasn't played out the way he thought. But did he want this basic idea all along, or was it an act of almost desperation, not out of a threat to his personal rule, but because he saw things getting worse over time instead of better? And then connected to that, what has he done to his own image because of this? He can talk all he wants about being a master strategist, or maybe I'm just thinking of the Darth Putin Twitter account, but he can give the impression that he's a master strategist and that, the special military operation is going, the way he wants it to because it's accomplishing X, Y, and Z. But everybody knows that this is not ideal. And can he get what he wants in the way that he wants it anymore? Or is his image degraded enough? And I just don't know how to get at that with so many non-diagnostic variables, we would say, so much we're seeing that could be explained. It could go towards an explanation either way.
Well, I think Putin has repeatedly stated in recent months his terms. I think he does have a goal in mind. Look, if you want the war to end, it's pretty easy. Recognize Crimea, recognize the Donbass and Luhansk areas and the Zaporozhye and Kherson. These provinces, I say, are Russian, that they are now part of Russia. And then you have to formally recognize the fact that you can't ever join NATO. That's all. Then the war would end. But I do think that's actually that's what he wants. When we ask, what does he want? That's it. To get less than that, I think would make him actually politically vulnerable. Because people would start to say, wait a minute, we went to the war and what's left of Ukraine is going to join NATO? Really? I thought that was the security threat we were trying to fight. Right. And then we lost how many? 300,000 to 500,000 men, either dead and casualty-wise, plus the exodus. Is that really credible as a success story? Or that was a huge mistake. And I do think the Ukraine war is going to be one of the triggers. If there is to be some kind of action, it'll be this war. And the problem for the plotters here is they all signed on to this war. Putin very cleverly had this televised Security Council meeting, and every single member of this inner circle had to say why this was such a great idea, why they supported it. And if you think about a historical analogy, Khrushchev, when he launched the de-Stalinization in 1956, he was one of Stalin's henchmen, and somehow he managed to pull it off. So it's doable, but it's not easy.
Well, there's so much more to talk about, but I will point people to your Foreign Affairs article from, I believe it was late 2022, maybe? Yeah, October 2022, Putin's Risk Spiral, where you looked at the logic of escalation and what this could lead to. But I think you know that we end our conversations here on Chatter with our magical chatterbox. So let me reach in and find a question for you here. Peter, name one dead political or national security related leader from any era who we could really use right now.
I guess Franklin Delano Roosevelt would be very high on my list.
Huh. He has a really interesting relationship with Russia and the Russians. Closer relationship than any other president in history up to that point in dealing with Russia, but also seeing it through a very different lens than we can imagine of a total war economy and the need to make accommodations that were unpalatable then and almost unimaginable now.
David, I'm sorry. I may have misunderstood your question. Did you mean in the context of relations with Russia?
Oh, no. I was just applying it to Russia. Okay. But I think FDR would be interesting on Russia because he spent more time, with Russian leaders than all American presidents up to that point combined. So there's that. But what about FDR in particular outside of Russia?
I was thinking more about his role as a domestic leader.
Yeah.
His ability to bring people together.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the circumstances, the Great Depression and World War II were contributing factors. But he had the political savvy and the personality and genuineness to be able to bring the country together through two very difficult periods. And in foreign policy, he did make some hard choices that people still are angry about, like Yalta, for example. But, if you're into the realist school, when the Red Army occupies much of the land, I think FDR realized that there's not a whole lot we're going to do here. This is going way far. I am also a big fan of Harry Truman and Eisenhower for similar reasons. I think Truman did really amazing things in helping to set up NATO and deal with actually implementing a containment policy.
Yeah. And
Eisenhower was very open to the importance of expanding or at least attempting to improve the bilateral relationship. In the 11-day visit of Khrushchev to the U.S., which is a fascinating story, by the way. Mm-hmm. But his efforts to try to bring this relationship to a more open, communicative relationship, which was then undermined by the Gary Francis Powers and the shoot down of the U-2 in 1960. But I think he had the right instincts about we need to find a way to manage this relationship in a way that minimizes nuclear threats, but also that we have areas we could probably work well together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm thinking as you're saying that about FDR, Truman, Eisenhower. None of them are perfect. None of us are. But you can look back at American history in the century before that, and you could find plenty of 3 presidents in a row who sucked, right? You can find, like Fillmore, Pearson, Buchanan before the Civil War, who just objectively were not our top presidents. And yet I think too few people have recognized that FDR, Truman, Eisenhower, obviously different backgrounds, different politics, different circumstances, but perhaps the most challenging 25 years of American history for different reasons. And yet those 3 of them at that time, looking back, did pretty well with the situation that was at hand.
I totally agree. That whole period, Dean Acheson's book, President of the Creation, I think is a great capsule or a window into the huge geopolitical challenges facing these American presidents.
Yeah.
It's pretty remarkable that they navigated it, I think, pretty well. And some serious crises with the Soviets, too. The Berlin crisis, multiple ones in 58 and 61, the missile crisis.
Yeah, things could have been, we can always play hypotheticals, but things could have been a lot different with with a James Buchanan as president in 1950. That's for sure. Peter, thank you so much for this conversation. I've appreciated you allowing me to pick your brain and take you on crazy tangents here and there. I've learned a lot, and hopefully our listeners have. Like I said, I'll send a link in our show notes to your Foreign Affairs article to make sure that people do get the full benefit of your deeper analysis on some of these topics. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much, David.
That was Chatter, a production of Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. Please subscribe to the podcast and find us on Twitter at ThatWasChatter.